welcome to the second session of Faith2Face. So glad you could come back. And we hope that you will stay connected for future sessions, either in person at Meriden Church, 5th Street in Meriden at 9 o'clock on Sundays, or online on our YouTube or Facebook page. Just look for Meriden Church. You'll remember from last time that I had shared that I did not come from a typical Christian home, but that I had gone to boarding school from age 8 years, where I attended church 15 times a week. After that, I had declared that, in my opinion, I had attended enough church for a whole lifetime. God had other plans, though. Through the guidance of, remember the man, the not so boring leader at the church my wife was attending, I came to see, through the scriptures, the truth of the story of God and the certainty of our salvation in Jesus Christ as we come to him in faith. I didn't want to be a Christian, but I had come to the conclusion that it was true. Why? What evidence is there for Christianity? You can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, is very, very important. But science answers different kinds of questions to the kind of questions that are answered by faith. Science answers the questions, when and how did this world come into being? What it can't answer is the question, who and why? So that's the difference between science and faith. Science is very important because it deals with scientific questions. But equally, faith is really important. Why? Well, because it answers some very fundamental questions about life. And everyone has faith. An atheist has faith. An atheist has faith that there is no God. You can't prove that mathematically or scientifically. And those of us who believe in Jesus do so on the basis of evidence. I myself, to be quite honest, could not be a Christian if it was kind of like a blind leap of faith, if there was no evidence at all. If you just had to believe. But I believe that in fact there is some very good historical evidence. Historical evidence is real evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. A lawyer uses what you might call historical evidence. Every time a jury brings back a verdict, what they're doing is judging on the basis of things that had happened in history, what they had heard, the evidence of history. They were not there, they didn't see anything, they just heard a message. And so every jury decision is, in fact, a step in faith, that we have assessed all of this story, the evidence of the story, and we have arrived now at our conclusion. And so it is that we also have to use the same means to make up our minds about Jesus. And that is also a step of faith. I came to believe in God because of Jesus. It seemed to me that the resurrection of Jesus, his coming alive from death, which I'd come to believe in, and we'll come back to that, strongly suggests that this world in which we live, in all of its wonder and beauty, has a creator. And that creator is to be seen in terms of and through the lens of Jesus. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. You can't get to know someone unless they reveal themselves. No one can get to know you unless you reveal yourself. And if there is a God, and he wanted to reveal himself to us, just think about this. What would be the best way to do that? It seems to be logical that he would reveal himself to us in such a way that we could actually understand in a human being, like me or you. So then, what is the evidence? Well, first of all, what is the evidence that Jesus even existed? Some people say, well, maybe Jesus didn't ever exist. But there's overwhelming historical evidence that he did. No serious historian anywhere would suggest that Jesus didn't exist. And we know from the evidence outside of the New Testament that Jesus existed outside of the New Testament, outside of the Bible. And we know that from historians like Tacitus or Suetonius. The first century Jewish historian Josephus wrote this about Jesus. And I quote from his book, obviously translated into English. There was about this time, he wrote, a man named Jesus, a doer of wonderful works. And then he goes on to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus and what he calls the alleged resurrection of Jesus. And so, even outside of the New Testament, there is evidence. But most of our evidence comes from inside of the New Testament. Now, of course, the New Testament was written a long, long, long time ago, 2,000 years. And people say, well, how do we know that what we have here in the Bible hasn't been changed over the years? And the answer is, we do know. How do we know? Well, we know it through a science called textual criticism. Essentially, the way that criticism or textual criticism works is like this. The more manuscripts that you have of a particular document, and the earlier that those, or the older that those documents are, the more you can be sure about what the original document actually said. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC, that's before Christ. Earliest copies we have are about 900 AD. So there's a 1,300-year gap, and we only have 8 copies of each. Yet no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Livy's Roman history, there's a 900-year gap, and there are 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I studied in Latin at school, 950-year gap, 9 to 10 copies. Tacitus, 1,000-year gap, 20 copies. And then we come to the New Testament, written between 400 and 100 AD. The earliest manuscripts are dated AD, that's after the death of Christ, 130, in the year 130. There are 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 scripts in Latin, 9,300 scripts in other languages. Totally unique amongst ancient prose writings. And one of the greatest ever textual critics, F.J.A. Hort, said this: in the variety and the fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst all of the ancient prose writings. And no secular historian would disagree with that. And so, what do we have? Well, we know from the evidence outside and inside the New Testament that Jesus existed. And here's our real question for today. But who is Jesus? We know that he was fully human. He had a body, emotions, experiences. But many today would say, yes, that's true. He was a human being. We know he existed. Maybe he was a great human being. Maybe he was even a great religious teacher. But no more than that. To suggest that he was the Son of God, to suggest that he is God, well, that's just going too far. So then, there are two parts to this argument. The first part of the argument is this: what did Jesus think about himself? Because if Jesus didn't think that he was God, that's kind of like the end of the argument. And even if he did, the second part of the argument is this: was he actually right? So we're going to examine these two things in the rest of the session this morning. So our first point is, what did Jesus say about himself? The first bit of evidence here is that Jesus' teaching was clearly centered on himself. Great religious teachers over the years have always pointed away from themselves. They don't say, hey, look at me, look at God. Jesus, who personified humility, said, look at me, come to me, he said. This question of ultimate meaning and purpose, what is our life about? This sort of sense of what you might call a spiritual hunger that we addressed in our last session, this sense that other things don't quite satisfy, however good these things are, there's always this slight void, this sense that something is missing. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you want your hunger satisfied, come to me. John chapter 6 and verse 35. There's stuff in our lives that we don't like. I have stuff in my life that I don't like. I'm sure you do too. I have things, habits, that I find quite addictive. In John chapter 8 and verse 36, Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus, he was saying, if I set you free, you will be truly free. And then there's all the stuff we carry around: worry, anxiety, fear, guilt. Jesus said to us, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. If you want peace, peace of mind, come to me, he says in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28. He said in Matthew 10 and verse 40, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you have seen me, you have seen God. A little child was once drawing a picture of God in class, Sunday school class. And the teacher said, what are you doing? And so the child said, I'm drawing a picture of God. So the teacher said, what do you mean? You can't draw a picture of God. No one knows what God looks like. And the child said, they will as soon as I finish this picture. And so what Jesus was saying is that if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. If you've seen me, you have seen God. So those are the direct claims. Then there are also the indirect claims. Jesus claimed to be able to forgive sins. He went up to people and he said, your sins are forgiven. Now, of course, if someone offends you, you can forgive them. But you can't go up to some random person in the street and say to them, your sins are forgiven. They'd say you were crazy. They'd think that you needed to go somewhere chased by men in white coats. When Jesus said that, the lawyers said, who can forgive sins? but God alone. You see, they were understanding exactly what Jesus was saying about himself. Forgiveness is at the heart of what Jesus came to do, to make forgiveness possible. It's at the heart of Christianity. C.S. Lewis, who we will quote oftentimes in this series, says, "A Christian is someone who forgives the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in us." If you have a Bible there with you, you might like to turn to John chapter 10. John chapter 10 and verse 30. We're going to read the 3 verses from verse 30 to 33 in John chapter 10. What Jesus said there is this: I and the Father are one. Now that's a claim tantamount to claiming to be God. That was blasphemy in the eyes of the people at the time. And so they picked up stones. They wanted to throw stones at him to kill him, because that was the punishment for someone who blasphemed. And Jesus said, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these are you wanting to stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human, are claiming to be God. I think that if you look at all the evidence, it's clear that Jesus did, in fact, make that claim. It's an astonishing claim. But of course, a claim like that needs to be tested. And really, if you think about it, there are only 3 possibilities. Either what Jesus was saying was not true, and Jesus knew perfectly well that it was not true, in which case he's a fraudster, or else it was not true, and he just didn't simply realize that it was not true. He genuinely thought he was God, in which case he was deluded, or as we would say, insane, mad. But logically, there is only one other possibility, and that is that it's true. So C.S. Lewis, again, one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century and the well-known author of the Chronicles of Narnia, he said this about Jesus' claims. He said, a man who was merely a man and who said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But let's not come up with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that simple option open to us, and he did not intend to. So then that comes, or takes us to the second point of Jesus' claims. What evidence is there to support the claims that Jesus made? Was Jesus right in what he said about himself? What evidence is there to support his claims? Well, here's the first piece of evidence. And obviously, it's his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then this totally revolutionary the first person ever to say, love your enemy. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our entire civilization in the Western world. Many of our laws were originally founded on the teaching of Jesus. We have advanced in every field of science and technology. Just think of how much we have gone forward in the last 10 years in those areas. Yet in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved upon the moral teachings of Jesus. They are the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words that you would expect God to say. So the first piece of evidence is his teaching. The second point is his life, what he did while he lived on this earth. I thought, as I said last time, that Christianity was boring. I thought that Jesus would be a bore. I thought he would be the kind of person who would turn wine into water, not water into wine. I was amazed to read of Jesus going to a party. It would have been so much fun to be with Jesus. He went to a party and the wine ran out and he said, "Hey guys, go and get all those jars over there. Fill them up with bath water and start pouring it out for the guests." And then they started pouring out, and wow, there was the greatest wine you could imagine. Beautiful, beautiful tasting wine. And that was attested by the host of the feast. But you see, it wasn't just his miracles, but it was his love for the marginalized. Jesus fed the hungry, he healed the sick, and ultimately he laid down his life for us. Jesus said this, and we quote this almost every Anzac Day. "Greater love hath no man than this, than that he lay down his life for his friends." And then there's the character of Jesus. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who wouldn't even call themselves Christians. Time magazine described Jesus as the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the whole history of humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him really well said, "This guy is without sin." I often think that the real test of character is when we're under pressure. And Jesus, when he was being tortured, said about his torturers, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And then there's the fulfillment of prophecy. No one else in the history of the world has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies, 29 of those prophecies in a single day. Well, you might say, well, maybe what Jesus did was that he got hold of the Old Testament and he read all of those prophecies and he thought, right, I'm going to go around, I'm going to fulfill all of these, and then everyone will have to be convinced that I am the one that the Old Testament is talking about. The problem, though, is just the sheer number of them. And humanly speaking, actually Jesus had no control. The exact manner of his death was prophesied, the place of his burial, his resurrection. Even the place of his birth was prophesied. Reading through the Old Testament, Jesus might have read, "Oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. Oh, it's too late. I'm already born." And then it's his conquest of death. And that's the cornerstone of Christianity. It is so relevant to every single person here because statistically speaking, 1 in 1 had to die. There was once a headline in The Onion, which is a kind of radical newspaper, a satirical magazine, which said, the world death rate, said the headline, is holding steady at 100%. Well, that's reality, isn't it? And you know, the Victorians used to talk a lot about death, but they never talked about sex. We talk a lot about sex, but we very, very seldom talk about death in today's world. It's kind of like something that we don't mention. Even in hospitals, they now try to avoid using the word death or dying. I heard of one hospital where they said, you must never use the word death or dying or died. And so they had a really politically correct way of describing it. They said it was a negative patient care outcome. But you know what? People do die. And when you go to a funeral and the coffin goes into the ground, it looks absolutely final. And it is. Unless death has been conquered. Unless when Jesus died and was buried and was raised to life, if he was, then there's hope for us beyond this life. But is that just wishful thinking? Well, it is, unless there's evidence. And so let's take a moment now to consider the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. First of all, let's think about his absence from the tomb. No one has ever satisfactorily explained why Jesus' body was not there on the first Easter day. People have come up with all kinds of explanations and theories. The authorities stole the body. Well, in that case, why did they not just simply produce the body when everyone else was saying that Jesus had been seen? They couldn't. I find this piece of evidence fascinating, that when the disciples heard that Jesus had been raised from the dead, they ran to the tomb. And when they got to the tomb, they looked in, and what they found were the grave clothes of Jesus still there. The only valuable thing for a robber to steal was in fact left behind. And they'd collapsed, those grave clothes, like a caterpillar's cocoon, and the butterfly had vanished. It was metanoia, metamorphosis. And the piece that had been around his head, the headband around the head of the dead Jesus, had been folded up and been put in another place. And it says that when they saw that, they believed. So not only his absence from the tomb, and then his presence with the disciples, Jesus was also seen on several occasions. On one occasion, the Bible tells us, by more than 500 people. And they all saw him on the same occasion. Some people said that they were hallucinating. Well, hallucination does occur amongst highly strung, highly imaginative, very nervous people, or people who are sick, or have very high temperatures, or are on drugs. The disciples didn't seem to fit any of those categories. They were cynics, like Thomas. They were tough fishermen. They were tax collectors. Tax collectors don't hallucinate. And then there was the transformation of the disciples. Here was a group of people, depressed, disillusioned, because the one that they had followed, the one they had been with for 3 years, had died and had been buried. And suddenly, when they find this empty tomb, they're going around saying, "We've seen Jesus. He really is alive." Now, most of the disciples died pretty horrific deaths as a result of their beliefs. Some were crucified. Some were beheaded. Some were tortured. And all they had to say was, no. It's all actually not true. We didn't really see him. We were just pretending. But they didn't do that. Those people would not have died for something that they would have known was not true. But they knew that it was true because they had seen the risen Jesus. And as a result, this movement, and it's a movement without precedent in the whole history of the world, swept the whole known world, and it has no parallel, and it's still happening. Do you know that there are 2,300 million Christians in the world today? 2.3 billion Christians of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every economic, social, and intellectual background. They all speak of this encounter with the risen Jesus. And so when we look at what Jesus claimed about himself, the first part of the argument, it's clear that Jesus did claim to be a man whose identity was God. Was he deluded? Was he a fraud? When you look at it, when I look at the evidence of his teachings, the things that he did, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection, it seems to me to be absurd, illogical, unbelievable to say that he was insane or a fraud. On the other hand, I find the strongest possible supporting evidence that what Jesus said about himself was, in fact, true. And that's how I came to the conclusion that Christianity is true and that Jesus is God. But it's one thing to believe it here. And for me, I tried to put it off because I wasn't keen on the implications of it being true for my life. I thought that I could put off being a Christian following Jesus until my deathbed, maybe. But then I thought to myself, that wouldn't be very intellectually honest. And so what I did, way back at the age of 27, I basically said, okay, yes, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, God with us, Emmanuel. And at that moment, I experienced in my heart a real encounter with Jesus, who changed my life in a very radical way. And I experienced that rather than it being some kind of, terrible thing that was going to happen to me, that when Jesus said, I have come to you that you might have life and have all of its fullness, that is exactly what I have experienced for the last 45 years. Of course, it's not always easy. Of course, there are ups and downs. Of course, I mess up. But I found that it really is true. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. And that encounter totally changed my life. Christians believe that Jesus is God. It is a step of faith based on evidence. Even so, a full understanding of Jesus can't happen historically or intellectually. It still has to drop from head to heart. There needs to be an experience of a relationship. And that has been the experience of millions of Christians down through all the ages.